Good evening and welcome to the British School and to the second lecture in our series accompanying our annual master's course in the topography and archaeology of the city of Rome. Our speaker tonight is Costas Panayotakis, who is Professor of Latin at the University of Glasgow. Costas is currently Hugh Last Fellow here at the school and has also held visiting fellowships at Oxford, Pisa, Göttingen, Cyprus and Melbourne, and was Alston Fellow at the BSR in 2012. His first book, Theatrum Arbitrae, was a comprehensive study of the influence of Roman popular theatre, especially mime, on Petronius, and this then led him to investigate Christianity and the mime, as well as the social portrayal of mime actors. He published a detailed commentary and first ever English translation with new Latin text of the fragments of the uncouth playwright Liberius for Cambridge University Press's Orange series in 2010, and he's currently working on Latin moral maxims and on the fragments of Atellane comedy for a new volume of the Loeb Classical Library series. Tonight's lecture is being recorded, and I remind those of you watching on Zoom that you can join in the discussion at the end of the talk by sending your questions to us using the Q&A panel on the screen. So, without further ado, would you now please welcome Costas Panayotakis and the Theatre of the Roman Mime, Texts and Material Culture.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It is a huge pleasure and an honor for me to be back in Rome and to the community of the beloved BSR in person. And I am most grateful to you, Robert, for the invitation and the opportunity I have been given to speak to the students of the City of Rome course and to friends and colleagues, both here and at home, about low-life Roman drama, on which I have been working for some years now. My aim with this simple and rather general presentation is to give you an overview of the pitfalls associated with understanding the theatrical literary genre of the Roman mime that has sadly been transmitted to us only in very short metrical or quasi-metrical citations written in Latin. These citations or fragments survived because the erudite polymaths, the Latin grammarians, and the late antique lexicographers who cited them found them interesting, mainly from linguistic, stylistic, and literary points of view, and less so because they thought highly of them as dramatic compositions or as theatrical spectacles. For example, the longest quotation we have from a mime play entitled Ana per Ana consists of just two words, which in English say, "Purse your dear little lips for a kiss." The only reason we have even this brief citation is because Nonius, the late antique lexicographer who quoted, was interested in the unusual verb to purse the dear little lips, which is unattested elsewhere in Latin literature. This play is attributed to Laberius, a controversial and celebrated playwright of the time of Cicero and Julius Caesar. Laberius is said to have written uncouth comic plays belonging to a Roman theatrical category known as mime, a literary form of socially disreputable drama. My argument tonight is that neither the extant fragments from the Latin mime-scripts nor the testimonies associated with mime-drama, when studied on their own, give us an accurate picture about mime as popular entertainment or about the elusive position of mime playwrights, mime actors, and mime actresses in the artificial, literary, and fluid social hierarchy of the Roman world. For this to happen, I argue, we should also look at the material culture associated with the mime. My point will be that we can see a tension between the impression that most literary sources give us about this form of entertainment and the impression given by the visual and inscriptional evidence. I can think of some reasons, both poetic and sociopolitical, about the biased picture given by the literary sources, but at the same time, I would not rush to privilege the documentary evidence. For I must confess that visual culture too has its own prejudices. And so I believe that by combining the evidence from the material culture with the textual evidence, the picture of the Latin mime in Roman society becomes more blurred and more dissonant, and for this reason, a bit more credible and a bit more accurate. I have divided my talk into 3 parts. I begin with some very basic and well-known information about the Latin mime and its repertory, and I consider the ancient reception of the mime playwright Laberius. I then demonstrate how epigraphical evidence and funerary visual culture may challenge the potentially misleading social and artistic stereotypes which operated in relation to mime theatre. I finish with an example of how new discoveries in art and archaeology can open up new perspectives in our study of the ancient mime as script and as spectacle. The English word mime, when used as a verb, indicates the acting of a play or a role, normally without words, by means of gestures and bodily movement. When used as a noun, it signifies the play that is being performed and the performer himself or herself. This form of modern theatre should not be confused with what the Romans understood by the word mime, mimus, the Latinized form of the Greek noun mimos. It is in fact easier for me to give you a negative definition of the ancient mime rather than to tell you exactly what it was. This is so because the literary sources and the inscriptional evidence attested in Italy and the southeastern parts of the Mediterranean seem to have understood mime as a heterogeneous form of crowd-pleasing entertainment that covered all kinds of unscripted or scripted spectacles, which did not belong to masked tragic and comic drama, and in which various artists, actors in Latin mimi, and actresses in Latin mimae, real women, not men dressed as women, enacted mainly low-life situations and used words in their performances. These shows seem to have been performed at Rome from the 28th of April until the 2nd of May on an annual basis, at least from 173 BC. We cannot say with certainty what the storylines were in mime plays performed on Italian ground in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Although Peter Wiseman has plausibly suggested that they depicted stories that had to do with the myths and the early history of Rome. In any case, by the 1st century BC at the latest, a Roman mime play, at least in its literary form, would not have been based on comic improvisations, but would have had an artistically composed storyline expressed through words written in Latin, not as far as we know in Greek, and in verse. That is, there would have been a script with literary qualities composed in spoken, recited, or even lyric verse, that would metrically scan. The mime play would have been composed by the mime playwright or mimographer. More often than not, he would have been a mime actor as well, who in all likelihood will have been commissioned by a high-standing official to compose it for a festival to be performed in front of a live audience, and not for private reading. The mimographers of the late Republic surely had literary aspirations for their plays, but they composed them not for a small circle of upper-class erudite viewers, although some of them too would have gone to the theatre to watch them. There would have been unmasked and barefoot actors and actresses performing the mime script, and some of them would have been bald-headed in order to assume the very popular role of the mimus calvus or stupidus, in Greek the moros phylakros, the bald-headed fool with whom the church fathers were enraged at a later stage in the history of mime drama. According to the majority of the literary sources, the public and moral status and reputation of most of these actors and actresses would have been as low in the social hierarchy as the status and reputation of prostitutes and gladiators. Some of them would have been freedmen and freedwomen, and the rest would almost certainly have been trained slaves who perhaps traveled to Italy to exercise their profession. Most of them, therefore, were presented by the literary sources as socially marginalized characters and morally ambiguous figures who were moving in social circles inappropriate to and incompatible with the upper classes. Now, alongside these mime performers of plays based on a script, there existed a large number of artists whose professional title has been interpreted as relevant to the large umbrella term mime. These are the artists whose specialization was expressed by mostly Greek composite words. Some of them you see on the PowerPoint: mimologos, biologos, archaeologos, neaniskologos, etologos, moros, homeristes, orchestes, taumatopoios, and others whom I have no time to mention here. I have not translated them into English because it's very difficult to find single words to render what these artists were supposed to be doing. Surely, though, those whose professional role ended with the word logos, speech, would have used words to achieve or perform their specialization. So a biologos would have used words to enact scenes from the bios, the everyday life. These performers give the strong impression of modern-day street artists, skillful imitators, and comic circus players, and show how difficult it is to pigeonhole the ancient mime as a form of entertainment with fixed characteristics. The exact date of the first appearance of a mime actor or actress on the stage of a Roman temporary theatre during a festival or in an event that formed part of the entertainment at a private dinner party is unknown. That the mime profession, however, was clearly associated in the Roman mind with Greek-speaking lands is clearly inferred both from literary and from documentary sources. And it formed an assumption which was fruitfully exploited in Roman cultural discourse as part of political invective, satirical abuse, and moral warning against the influence of foreign cultures, and especially against the influence of mime-drama. Our earliest attestation of the noun mimus, mime actor, comes from the epitaph of Protogenes, found on a Stilli in Samnium in south-central Italy, and is dated probably to the early 2nd century BC. Here lies the charming Protogenes, slave of Clulius, a mime actor, who gave the people very many delights with his charming nugae. The charming Protogenes may have been a slave when he died, and this is possible because he is recorded as having only one name, not 3. But it is also possible to assume that he died a freed slave, since we have evidence of mime actors who were manumitted during their lifetime. The inscription on the Stilli is interesting for many reasons. The Greek morphology of Protogenes' name and the Greek origins of the word mimus, designating his profession, stress his foreignness to the passerby, while the reference to the people, the populus, whom he greatly delighted, you see pluruma gaudia, suggests that he performed most favorably. I take the superlative degree, very many, pluruma, to indicate that Protogenes performed both many times and in front of large audiences. The word mimus, with which his identity is being defined, is not explained further. And this, to me, indicates that the readers of the inscription would have probably understood the word as a theater-related term, and that mime, as a form of entertainment, had been integrated in Italian theatrical culture by the early 2nd century BC. Nothing in the inscription shows whether Protogenes held a specialized role in a troupe. For instance, he is not called a leading mime actor. In fact, it is not clear that he even performed as part of a theatrical troupe at all. He may have been giving solo performances. It seems that he entertained his audience with charming nugae, a difficult word to translate into English, since it is usually given a disparaging meaning, indicating something, an action or a thing that is frivolous, unimportant, and of no consequence. I wonder, however, given that the word nugae here should not have a negative meaning within a funerary context of praise, and given also that the inscription attests to the use of the technical term mimus, whether nugae here refers not to frivolous comic actions, which an amateur comedian would perform, but to a polished and artistically presented theatrical role or show which Protogenes specialized in. Some years ago, in fact, Luciano Cicu has suggested that the plural noun nugae here is the Latin equivalent of the Greek singular noun paignion, a piece of theatrical entertainment with music, dance, and jokes, and that it represents the comic activities of traveling entertainers. Whether Protogenes' nugae, a word of unknown etymology, is a Latin rendering of the Greek paignion, I do not know. But I am attracted to the hypothesis that long before the time of Catullus and Horace and Martial, who employed this word to refer to literary works, nugae may have indicated a skillfully presented show. To Cicu's hypothesis, One may add that in documentary evidence, we find the technical term nugarii in a 1st century AD Roman funerary inscription with reference to 2 people, the freedman Gaius Portumius Hellenus and Calpurnia Anapauma, possibly a freedwoman and his companion in life. The mysterious term nugarius seems to me to indicate someone who deals professionally with nugae. The word nugarius does not exist in large Latin dictionaries, but Latin words which end in arius normally indicate people who do something for a living. So a nugarius may have designated a person who plays the fool or tells tall stories as a means of earning their living. In any case, I would read Protogenes' Stilli as a monument that paid tribute not only to the artistic skills of this actor, but also to the frivolities of mime as spectacle. Protogenes was deemed worthy enough to be remembered precisely for those skills, and the frivolities he performed while alive do not seem to have been looked down upon after his death. But by the 1st century BC, mime comes into the hands of pioneering dramatists, such as Laberius, who composed mime plays around the mid-1st century BC, and actors such as Publilius, who both wrote mime plays and acted in them in the mid-50s BC, in the 50s BC. It's unfortunate that only tiny fragments, about 100, survive from their plays, for at that time, mime acquires a lot of public presence and socio-political power. And it is in the 1st century BC that scholarly authors such as Varro and Cicero refer to mime-scripts as distinct theatrical categories. The mime playwrights of the late Republic seem to have drawn heavily upon the Hellenistic and earlier Roman comic traditions to create their own characters and repertory. And it is possible to discern in the fragments of Laberius the portrayal of, for example, a lascivious wife, a flatterer, a parsimonious rich father, a jealous husband, as well as mockery of philosophy, mythological satire, parody of high literature, ridicule of Julius Caesar, adulterous affairs, unexpected reversals of fortune, false deaths, and a relatively new element in Roman drama, explicit sexual vocabulary, which Plautus avoided and Terence entirely omitted. This type of sexual vocabulary associated with erotic intercourse, bodily functions, and the sexual organs seems to have entered Latin drama about a generation before Laberius and Publilius, with the staged performances of literary Atellane comedy. You see, in fact, an example, an extreme example of this theatrical feature, new theatrical feature on the PowerPoint. The testimonies on the Latin mime almost unanimously, from Cicero, Horace, and the younger Seneca to Gellius, the church fathers, and late antique commentators on comedy, give an impression of morally decadent mime actors and actresses who behaved shamelessly in real life, and of linguistically low register mime scripts that abounded in vulgarities. In reality, however, most of these statements were useful artistic and social stereotypes, created and deliberately maintained not only by the testimonies of non-dramatic authors, but also by the mime playwrights themselves. And they tell us more about the Roman audience's cultural anxieties, their moral preoccupations, their literary aesthetics, their linguistic assumptions about specific social classes, and their fears for social control than they tell us about mime as a theatrical spectacle. Even when we confine ourselves to a brief examination of the ancient reception of just one mime playwright, Laberius, a multidimensional, ambiguous, and often confusing picture emerges. In the second half of the 1st century BC, Horace, when comparing the satirical poet Lucilius to Laberius, singled out Laberius's wittiness as the most distinctive feature of the mimeographer's style. But Horace's final judgment was that Laberius's mimes are not beautiful poetry because making the listener smile is not enough to make a poetic composition worthwhile. Horace does not say that Laberius's vocabulary is vulgar, but would have preferred polish, brevity, and a greater stylistic change. Not unlike Horace in this respect was Cicero, who in the mid-50s BC in the De Oratore acknowledges the wittiness of mime actors, and in fact refers to fragments of Roman mimes older than those of Laberius. The topical nature of mime satire seems to worry Cicero and attract him at the same time. And yet, he often expresses contempt for mime plays, both in his speeches and in his correspondence. Suetonius mentions Elusius Crassicius from Tarentum, probably a contemporary of Sulla, who is said to have helped mime playwrights and taught in a school. In the early 1st century AD, the celebrated Augustan poet Ovid, in the poems he composed while in exile, indicates that adultery mimes were composed by some poets, but not by Ovid himself, who could have done so had he wished it. In the 2nd century AD, Laberius is mentioned as a poet that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius is urged to study in order to polish his literary style. Fronto, Marcus Aurelius's eloquent teacher, commends Laberius for his choice of unusual words and for his inimitable expressions. On the other hand, Sulpicius Apollinaris, the distinguished tutor of the polymath Aulus Gellius, is reported to have criticized Laberius for the uncouth and undistinguished elements he introduced into the Latin language. On the PowerPoint, you see some of the words which Gellius disapproved in Laberius's vocabulary. But his negative judgment on many of them seems to me unjustified and rather puzzling. Recent studies on the language and style of the fragments of this playwright have shown that there are various layers of artistry in the extant corpus of Laberius, and that his work is not as unsophisticated or as linguistically uncouth as Horace and others would like us to believe. So the vulgarity and the uncouth character of the vocabulary of mime-scripts is not a straightforward or unproblematic issue. There may, of course, have been other reasons for the stereotypically low reputation of the mime in the late Republican and imperial societies. Reasons that had nothing to do with literary aesthetics, but everything to do with social reality and the theatrical practices under which mime operated and with which it was associated. For example, there seemed to have been no clearly pronounced moral message or edifying message in the storyline of these plays. The plays seem to have been enacted on stage by real and often naked, we are told, women as actresses who were regarded as prostitutes or may have actually been prostitutes. The actors and actresses do not seem to have worn masks. The exposure to the public gaze for financial purposes had devastating legal and social consequences for these people, precisely because the acting profession brought humiliation to most of them and glory to only a few. Finally, the on-stage presentation of morally objectionable material, such as adultery, in a crude fashion, contributed to the low reputation of the genre. However, these explanations, although perfectly plausible and many of them well-founded, ignore the impression given by the epigraphical evidence. Our literary sources are almost consistently disparaging towards mimes, but the documentary evidence, in particular the funerary inscriptions, can shed light on aspects of mime plays and mime actors which differ from the theatrical aspects mentioned by the literary sources. Epigraphical pieces of evidence can give us information about the formal organization and role distribution of the members of a mime troupe, the place of origin and social status of the deceased actor or actress, their skills, virtues, and popularity. Most importantly, they also demonstrate that some mime actors and actresses were honored with theatrical rewards, while male actors who owned a mime troupe could certainly hold public offices. The arch-mime Lucius Acilius Eutiches was a decurion at Bovillae. The arch-mime Titus Utiedius Venerianus held the official position of agent at Philippi in Macedonia. Tiberius Claudius Pilodogos Theseus from Marathon, probably head of a guild of Athenian biologoi, mime actors, was a citizen and a councillor of many cities. Flavius Alexander Oxeidas from Nicomedia in Bithynia, another biologos, was praised for his superior technique and the correctness of his behavior, and was a member of the Boulae of Antioch and Heraclea and of the Gerousia of Miletus. The second part actor, Gaius Norbanus Sorix, perhaps a relative of the famous leading actor and favorite of Sulla, Norbanus Sorix, may have held the office of Magister Pagi Augusti Felicis at Pompeii. Furthermore, an inscription on a stone marking the tomb of Maximinus, a 6-year-old boy, possibly from Antioch, records the lament of the child who remembers first his mother, Eutychia, a mime actress by profession, says the stone, and then his father, Eucharistus, whose profession is not even mentioned. Surely Eutychia's profession must have had some kind of importance to be included in the epitaph. Claudian, the father, and Castor, the husband of the mime actress Kyrilla from Beroia in central Macedonia, have included the woman's profession and her theatrical triumphs on the marble grave monument that commemorates her. No sense of feeling shame about the dead woman's profession here. The female arch-mimes, Claudia Hermiona and Fabia Arete, appear to have been powerful, wealthy, and highly respected if one takes at face value the information on their marble commemoration monuments. But documentary evidence too, and especially inscriptions on tombstones, like literary testimonia, have their fixed conventions and interpretative problems. And a good example of epigraphical stereotyping may be seen in a bipartite monument, which was found in the amphitheater in Aquileia and had been erected by the biologos Heraclides for his onstage partner and perhaps real-life partner, Basila, at some point in the second quarter of the 3rd century AD. The woman who once received a fame noised far and wide on the stage among many peoples and cities for her manifold talents in mime and then in dance. To this woman, the mime Basila, the 10th muse, who died many a time on stage, but never thus, to her, Heraclides, the biologos, clever in speaking, set up this monument. Though she is dead, she is honored just as she was in life, resting her tuneful body in the soil. So be it. Your fellow actors say, cheer up, Basila, no one lives forever. The text contains the typical formulaic references to the multitude of cities in which the deceased woman had triumphed as actress, line 1. Her skill in acting and dancing, line 3. And the mortality of the human race, lines 11 to 12. Formulas which the viewer, the reader, would easily have recognized. But there is also the highly prestigious, rarely applied to stage performers, and perhaps unjustified appellation of Basila as the 10th muse, line 5, a term most commonly associated and used in late antiquity for none other than Sappho. Even so, it would be impossible to guess the allegedly disreputable profession of the woman in question if you looked at the relief depicting her above the inscription. With her right hand solemnly raised over her left breast, and with a hairstyle that mirrored the fashionable hairstyle of the empresses Julia Domna and Julia Mamaea of the Severan period, Basila is portrayed not as a shameless actress, as literary sources and the church fathers describe the female mimes, but as a modest lady whose body, tightly covered by her garment, is invisible apart from her face. Her representation, itself a visual stereotype of the bona matrona, the good wife, combined with the Greek narrative below, attempts to undermine the typically negative comments of other sources against mime actresses, and elevates both Basila and her profession. It is interesting to compare the impression that Basila was a respected and decent member of the Society of Aquileia with the impression given by another funeral monument, this time belonging to Eucharistos, son of Eucharistos from Patara in Lycia, which was discovered in 1989 in Antalya, Turkey. Like the aforementioned Heraclides, Eucharistos was a biologos mime actor who, in the polymetric Greek poem of his tombstone, dating perhaps to the 3rd century AD, commemorating his life, is described as to stoma ton muson, the mouth of the muses. But in his funeral relief, he is depicted with a bald head and the big ears and eyes that characterized the role of the mimus calvus or stupidus, the bald-headed buffoon in the mime. This to me indicates that Eucharistos' theatrical specialization was a point of pride and success, not shame and failure in his life and career, and that the viewers would acknowledge this success through the image of the baldness of the head and the other facial features of Eucharistos when alive. The figure of the bald-headed buffoon appears also in a very famous object associated with the theater of the mime, that is a clay oil lamp from the Hellenistic period in Athens. This lamp bears an inscription on the back which identifies the figures on the facade with mimologoi, that is, mime actors who used words. And it names the title of the play, Hecura, the mother-in-law, which must have been a success. The front of the lamp shows three human figures. In the center, there is the characteristic bald-headed jester, barefoot as usual, with huge ears, a short tunic, and a thick belly. He stands between an old man and a younger man who seems to be complaining about something. The plot of the play is unknown, but the title is interesting, not only because we find it among the titles of Greek comedies of the Hellenistic era and of Roman comedy, but also because already in the 5th century BC, the Sicilian playwright Sophron had composed a female mime, that is, a work centered on the character of a woman with the same title, the mother-in-law. This, to me, indicates a continuity between dramatic genres and at the same time a fluidity amongst them throughout antiquity. Archaeological finds may also excitingly complement the corpus of the Roman mime that has come down to us through the indirect manuscript tradition. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, there had come down to us only one line from the mime play Colax, the Flatterer, which the lexicographer Nonius attributed to Laberius. This line said, "The human body catches fire by the hostile flame." And the only reason why it was cited was because the late antique lexicographer Nonius was interested in the morphology of one of the words in the citation. However, in 1912, a marble inscription about half a meter in width was published, which contained a couplet and was found in a columbarium, a room with niches for funeral urns to be deposited. This was located before the Porta Praenestina or Porta Maggiore in the Via Casilina, and it said, "Marcus Albius Pileros, Marcus is freedman. The human body catches fire by the hostile flame. The limbs of the living, now peaceful, turn into ashes. Alas." The inscription contains the name of the freedman Marcus Albius Pileros, who is mentioned probably because he is buried in the chamber, and also two unattributed verses, the first of which is almost identical to the line found in the work of Nonius, who attributes it to Laberius. The second line is not attested elsewhere. Marcus Albius Pileros is not otherwise connected with the theater or with mime in particular, and I am inclined to think that the couplet from Laberius's mime follows his name in the inscription, not because Pileros was an actor or an avid fan of Laberius, but because the elegant funeral imagery of the couplet was deemed appropriate for commemorating Pileros's death. The inscription illuminates in an extraordinary fashion how excerpts, even from allegedly low and vulgar literary genres, such as the mime, were extracted from their context and were attached to a cultural environment which had little to do with their original framework. The match between the somber atmosphere of the subterranean sepulchre and Laberius's extract, which talks about the flames of the funeral pyre overwhelming the human body, which then turns into ashes and rests in peace, demonstrates a perfect synergy between literature and material culture, at least in the world of ex-slaves. It should also be noted that this harmony may not have existed in the original theatrical context from which the extract was taken, and it is now impossible to demonstrate whether or not these lines were meant to be taken seriously when they were first performed. The importance of archaeological discoveries for our understanding of the ancient mime cannot be underestimated. At the start of my talk, I mentioned a mime play by Laberius entitled Anna Perana, from which the longest fragment is 2 words. There is almost no doubt that the woman referred to in the title of Laberius's mime is the same person as Anna Perena, the protecting goddess of the new year. Her festival, which featured indecent songs and drunkenness, seems to have been celebrated on the Ides of March at the first milestone on the Via Flaminia. In topographical terms, this signified an area, of course, in the Campus Martius, near the place where the Mausoleum of Augustus has been built. But about 20 years ago, an exciting discovery was made, which contextualized Laberius's comic play even more firmly within the religious life of Rome. An ancient fountain with dedications to Anna Perena was unearthed near Piazza Euclide, not far from the BSR, and the findings of this new shrine included objects associated with love and magical practices. All of these motifs, lewdness, inebriation, desire, magic, mythological satire, and perhaps political parody are appropriate themes in the low repertory of the mime. So our play, Anna Perana, would fit in very nicely with the evidence of sensual religious worship that has come to light. Furthermore, in her splendidly illustrated volume on theater and spectacle in the art of the Roman Empire, Catherine Dunbabin provides an authoritative account of scenes of mime in art. For reasons of time, I will presently focus on only one of them, and I would like to finish my presentation with the findings of the excavations which were carried out between 2005 and 2008 in Noeda, an area in the province of Cuenca in central Spain. For they have revealed a floor mosaic which in a sensational fashion exemplifies how material culture finds can enhance text-based research on fragmentary drama. The floor mosaic, dated to around AD 400 or soon after AD 400, forms part of the decoration of a huge 3-arched room and is divided into 5 rectangular mosaic panels with scenes A, B, C, D, E, and an area in the center of the room destined for a pool or fountain, F. The scholarly consensus is that this was the reception and dining room of a luxury country villa owned by a dominus who certainly had wealth, power, visitors, and perhaps also some education. 3 of the mosaic panels were meant to be viewed immediately by those entering the room, and they contain mythological scenes. There is the story of the chariot racing contest between King Oenomaus and the young suitor Pelops for the king's daughter Hippodameia. It is possible to see them happily holding hands as future husband and wife after Pelops's victory, while the winged boy Eros is still holding the reins of Pelops's chariot. There is also a visual sequence of the judgment of Paris, the abduction of Helen by Paris and her subsequent arrival to Troy. In these remarkably rare scenes, Paris is shown to be tenderly holding Helen by the hand and guiding her to blissful adultery. The panel that makes this mosaic important for my discussion is the northern panel, which is placed on one side of the fountain and contains possibly the only scene in the entire floor that has an inscription. This inscription helps us to identify the episode depicted on the floor. The scene shows 6 figures. At the lowest level, on the right-hand side, there seems to be a male child figure that is crouching on the feet of a toga-clad man and holding its hand in front of its eyes, probably crying. Observe that the child has no hair and his ear is pointed. Above the child, there is a wealthy-looking toga-clad man with big pointed ears and bald head, like the pointed ears and the bald head we saw in the funerary monument of the mime actor Eucharistos. And next to him, an extraordinarily elegant lady with eyes ambiguously turned towards the toga-clad man, presumably her husband, and sumptuous jewels decorating her neck and her long hair, which is tied at the back. The affluence of the characters of the mosaic seems to reflect the prosperity of the owner of this country villa, and it is arguable that the artist has adjusted details of the story of whatever is happening in the depiction to the luxurious environment in which the ancient viewers and visitors would be dining. The couple is shown comfortably seated, and there is a small, barely visible, that's quite important, barely visible chain connecting the woman's wrist to the man's wrist. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's important that you do. At the next level, behind the woman, there is an elegant bed from which a younger man with pointed ears and bald head emerges. He wears only a rough-looking cloak, perhaps only as long as his knee. And he's communicating with a woman who is very similar to, but not identical with, the elegant seated lady at the level below. It is possible that these 2 female figures are one and the same person, presented by the artist at different times in a temporal sequence. More plausible, though, is that these figures are different characters and that the woman standing may be an accomplice to the woman sitting. On the upper left-hand side, there is an elegant wooden frame that might have functioned as a door or as a screen. The same younger man, clearly in the same green cloak, appears to be hiding behind that screen or is about to enter through that door. The inscription above the people of the scene reads as follows in Latin letters: mimu, that is the mime play, with the final S having been omitted, zelotypi, that is of the jealous, and then numti, a nonsensical word written in 2 levels and emended by scholars to numati, that is, of the man loaded with money, of the wealthy man, or nupti, of the male spouse, of the male bride. Both of these emendations, however, are problematic. Given that our mosaicist does not seem to be a careful or educated worker, since he has carelessly omitted the letter S in mimus, and given that both mimus and zelotypus are Greek loan words, I favor neither numati nor nupti as explanations for the peculiar word numti, but the hypothesis that numti is an error for yet another Greek word, which the artist who didn't know Greek had been commissioned to write, namely nymphi, so that the inscription would then translate as the mime of the jealous groom. As long as the theatre of the mime existed in literary form, from the scripts of Laberius and possibly earlier to the testimonies of Horace, Ovid, Apuleius, the church fathers, and Sorix of Gaza in the 6th century, adultery was one of its stereotypical and most popular subjects, and was stigmatized as a cause of moral degeneracy already from Cicero's time. The wife, the maid who acts as go-between, the hiding of the adulterer, the stupidity of the jealous husband, all these are characters and motifs easily traceable in the Mosaic. However, our non-theatrical textual sources and the literary fragments tell us nothing about neglected crying babies, or about adulterous wives tied with a chain onto their jealous husbands. Are we and the ancient visitors at the house meant to view the chain and the crying baby as parts of the mime-drama, or should we interpret them as allegories which symbolize the distrustful nature of the insecure husband, the imprisonment of the wife in a wealthy but unhappy marriage, and her dereliction of duties as mother? The two options are not mutually exclusive. The weeping child, for example, could well have exemplified the mother's lack of interest, both in her marriage and in her offspring, who incidentally is depicted as a miniature of her husband. However, it is striking that a crying baby features also in a theatricalized legal speech composed centuries earlier than our Mosaic in classical Athens. The speech was written by the celebrated Attic orator Lysias for Euphiletos, a man whose wife seems to have cheated on him with another man called Eratosthenes. The husband killed the adulterer and then defended himself on the grounds that the victim had committed adultery with his wife. In the speech that Lysias wrote for the husband Euphiletos, the baby is actually presented as an instrument in the hands of the conniving maid, who is thus facilitating the adulterous affairs of her mistress. Should we visualize a similar case also for the story in the Mosaic? This is plausible, but no more than a speculation. Likewise, it is possible for the chain under discussion to make sense within the immediate context of the floor of which the mime panel forms part. I mentioned previously that the gestures of the hands in the other couples portrayed in the Mosaic are significant, and that they show, perhaps in a version of the celebrated visual marriage motif of the so-called joining of the right hands, the mutual willingness of a man and a woman to embark on a love relationship at premarital stage. In contrast, the chain linking the jealous husband to his wife demonstrates the deterioration of the relationship at its post-marital stage. But the chain of the wife may also be viewed not as her punishment or as her imprisonment after the husband has found out about the adultery, but as the husband's silly method of preventing his wife from committing adultery. To conclude then, in this talk, I have argued that one way of testing the accuracy of the testimonies of the literary sources about Roman mime as a socially disreputable form of drama is to look at material culture associated with the ancient mime. This then led me to emphasize that material culture, despite its own biases and prejudices, which are articulated through visual formulas and stereotypical expressions, crucially enhances, complements, qualifies, and sometimes corrects the textual sources on which we have come to depend so much in order to understand a cultural construct that has come down to us only in bits and pieces. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Costas for this wonderfully rich mixture of vulgarity and erudition, which has given these marginal and unjustly criticized artists the attention which they deserve. And from the point of view of our course, it's also done a great deal to bring to life some of the denuded monuments we've been looking at in the Campus Martius, and which we're going to see tomorrow at the rather better preserved theatre of Ostia. I assume we can imagine that these nugae would have been performed in such grand monuments, or?
I suppose Protogenes, of course, I have no idea whether or not he would have performed in stone theaters or in improvised temporary stages, or perhaps imagine something on the street or something set up for the occasion. There is so little that we know about that early stage in the history of Roman drama. And in fact, even the meaning of the word, as I said, is disputed.
So we can't necessarily imagine mimes being performed
in theaters. On the contrary, oh no, of course we can, and there is very good evidence for that, namely that these plays were commissioned to be performed in theaters. Oh yes, without a doubt. Oh yes, there is very good evidence for Laberius, Publilius, very strong, and throughout the centuries, from the 1st century BC onwards, after we had stone theaters in Rome.
And the mosaic we saw at the end looks to me, what, 4th century or something?
That's correct. The mosaic is around AD 400 or, oh yes. But it is remarkable that it found its way in such an affluent environment, perhaps sponsored by the dominus, the owner of the house.
Do we have any questions or comments? Lucas.
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much for this great talk. I was very struck by the plethora of pictures of these very entertaining figurines that you showed, and I wondered whether you could elaborate on the fine context of those figurines.
Oh, the figurines.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness, the figurines, and I have not even mentioned or discussed those. The best discussion, Lucas, for these figurines, and there is lots and lots of those, is Catherine Dunbabin's excellent book, Theatre and Spectacle in the Roman Empire, where she discusses these small figures, many of them really depicting characters that are disfigured or having remarkable facial characteristics, features, unforgettable, in all sorts of contexts and ways. But I wouldn't be able to tell you that all of them were mime actors. or definitely connected with the mime. Certainly, the congruence, the harmony between the bald-headed buffoon, who do not wear shoes, and some of them also have an enormous phallus, they are very likely to have been mime actors, because we have evidence from literary sources that support this hypothesis. Not all the figures, though, might have been performance of mime plays, but they are somehow related to the umbrella term mime. Now, would their function have been apotropaic? Would in other cases their function have been, why would you find decorations, for example, in houses with figures which resemble mime actors? The other very remarkable figure that I have not illustrated is with a pilus, the pointed hat, and the stick. Gosh, and yet I wouldn't be able to place them in relation to specific mime plays or a specific mime tradition. I wouldn't be able to give you a specific and ancient name for them in that respect. I think what I could do is, when we are in the library tomorrow, I will show you these, because there is such a variety that it is impossible to find an explanation, a consistent explanation for all of them. And perhaps, you know, Lucas, it is not possible to, it is not advisable to look for consistency in that respect.
Dustin.
Thank you very much, Costas. That was wonderful. Thinking of the epitaphs, where
Basila.
Yeah, where the deceased individuals are being lauded for their skill in mime. Do you think this might be speaking to a higher kind of status for mime actors amongst the Greek communities?
Oh, without a doubt, not only for Basila, but also for Eucharistos. These are very sophisticated compositions. Oh yes, you are meant to appreciate the allusions. You are meant to pick all these up. They were not haphazard, or now who would have commissioned them, i.e. it's interesting, who would have thought these, who would have composed them, that's another matter. But it creates, I think, very high expectations on the part of the viewer in decoding what they have seen, and then in connecting it with the upper part. So it's an intermediate kind of relationship that is most interesting. And in fact, the Eucharistos epitaph, the polymetric poem below, is even more complex.
We have a couple of questions here.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. Also about the epitaphs, is it possible to sense like a second degree or humoristic style too, in a way to be pride, to do something for the lower classes, but also to show the complexity of it, you know, like to show something to the upper class and the people who wrote the literary sources that we have now. Like maybe it's also a way to, yeah, to show the technicity, the things they know, but also to say, okay, we are doing funny things. And like now we have like artists or humorists on their epitaphs. It could be jokes or something like that, you know?
Yes, yes. As far as I remember, perhaps you will help me here, Victor. The Eucharistos inscription was remarkably serious in its metrical complexity and in its content. Do you remember in the Basila inscription, you said, you were asking me if it's possible to find any humorous, is that something that the others would find as humorous allusions or references? Yes, you remember that there was this reference to Basila, who died many times on stage? That, of course, would have been certainly an allusion to what was known in Petronius's Satirica as the mimica mors, the false death in that respect, and you have in Plutarch and elsewhere. So that is a motif. But and of course there is the dance and so on and so forth. Do you remember any other comical fixtures,
Yes.
Victor, in these inscriptions?
Yeah, sure. In fact, this sentence that you said that the actors have died many times, but only once in real life. It appears also in an inscription from a mime actor from Ostia Antica.
Oh, yes.
And then again from another inscription of another mime actor in Dalmatia, I think it was. And that's a way to recognize that they are actors, because sometimes they do not say that they are actors or artists, but they put this sentence in the epitaph, so you can recognize them as artists. And the reference to the 10th muse, I wouldn't say that it is humor. It is a reference to the erudition, to the training as artists, because we find them, these references to the muses or to the Haris or etc. in
Yes.
many inscriptions of artists in general, not only mimes, but also actresses, dancers, etc. So we find these common places constantly. Also that they have acted in many theaters in their lives, meaning that they are also part of moving companies. They didn't stay in just one place. They would tour an entire province or even broader regions. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor.
Oh, Alessandra.
Okay. So thank you very much, Costas, for this amazing talk. And I really love the idea of combining literary and epigraphic sources and material sources, of course. My question, of course, is on the epigraphic evidence that we have, and especially on the CLE 300 and I can't remember, 61 with the nugae. And so I was very fascinated by the term, which is like, it becomes like literary terminology.
You were
And
fascinated because of Marshall's
because
use
of
it.
Marshall uses this in connection, like in the preface of book 1, in connection
Yes.
to the Floralia, which is
Yes.
in which it says that his book is for the public of the Floralia, and these are nugae for the public of the Floralia, which are of course like of nude mimes basically. And I was wondering whether in these, because it is like such a specific terminology, we can see one of those instances in which it is literature drawing from epigraphic sources. So normally it is, we tend to see epigraphic verses drawing from literary and literature, but I was wondering whether in this case, and specifically thanks to Marshall's passage in which the nugae and the Floralia are so closely connected, whether we can see in this sense like a reverse view in which it is literature drawing from epigraphy.
This is plausible, Alessandra, very about what you say, precisely because of the mention of the Floralia. So what you suggest makes sense in that respect. Yes, certainly. So you would say that Marshall had something like that in mind, not the protogenes inscription, you mean, but the term as term.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So we could see a different instance. And I had another question, which is related to authorship.
Before you go to the
Yeah.
next question,
Sorry.
no, not at all. for people who are here and listening, and the problem with the new guy, I remember discussing this passage with Peter Wiseman, who in fact brilliantly suggested to me that this could perhaps represent the Latin rendering of Fliak's drama in the Roman vocabulary and the Italian tradition. It's really Wiseman's ideas really open windows, and you get to see things in a different way. Alessandra, thank you.
Yeah,
Your
thank you.
second
Yeah,
question?
yeah. The other question was about authorship. I know that is a very complicated and controversial question. And I was wondering, just like looking at the epitaph which quotes Laberius, some of the verses of Laberius,
Yes.
whether we can infer at least the agency of mimes into the composition of their own epitaphs, or whether we can perhaps try to think whether there is like some kind of society of mimes for their own burial and for the production of their own epitaphs, especially if we think about the columbarium. So I was thinking whether there were like any kind of professional association which guaranteed.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, there are. Oh, yes, there are. There is very good evidence for theatrical associations of mime actors. And in fact, it's even more interesting that we have inscriptional evidence. Am I right, Victor, for women? Yes, for actresses also, associations, yes. Mimarum sociarum or something along these lines. Yes, this does exist. But are you suggesting that the authorship of these lines in the columbarium is not Laberius, or?
No, I was
no.
just wondering whether like mimes, like our actors could be involved at some stage in the writing, in the production of their own verse epitaphs.
Yes, yes, I see. Yes, 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 I would imagine that would be possible. Although, as I said earlier, we do not know of Marcus Albius Pileros as an actor. We do not know of him as an actor. What's interesting also about this inscription is that the person who copied it has included the last word, alas, hem. That alas, it seems to me, when in its original context, was not spoken by the person who said the other words, but it was spoken by another person who was mocking the seriousness of a colax, a flatterer. That's the title of the play. Oh, it's from Ed. Hello, Ed. Oh, it's very nice. Yes. Oh, I see. Yes. And Joe, very nice. Hello, Joe. Joe is writing from Shropshire. Yes, very nice.
This is fantastic news that Laberius has reached Shropshire as well.
Yes.
So if we have no more questions, I think we shall thank Costas for this fantastically rich elucidation, which is going to really make our visit to Ostia tomorrow much more interesting, as well as a lot of the other trips as well. So we will offer him a con labella osculum and thank our audience and thank our online audience as well.